So Peter MacIntyre is professor of psychology, and Aisha, you're recording. Yes, Peter MacIntyre is professor of psychology at Cape Breton University. His research focuses on the psychology of language and communication. He has published over 125 journal articles and chapters on language anxiety, willingness to communicate, motivation, and other topics. He has co-authored or co-edited books on topics including positive psychology in second language acquisition, motivational dynamics, nonverbal communication, teaching innovations, and capitalizing on language learner individuality. His awards include being recognized for teaching excellence, Atlantic Association of Universities, the Gardner Award, International Association for Language and Social Psychology, and the Mildenberger Prize, Modern Language Association, for contributions to the study of language. His most recent book, edited with Ali Al-Houri on contemporary motivation theory, published in 2020 by Multilingual Matters, won the Hardwood Prize for Best Publication from the International Association for Language and Social Psychology. His upcoming book with Alistair Henry, Communication Stories, Willingness to Communicate in a Bilingual Community Context, will be also published by Multilingual Matters. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Professor MacIntyre to our research colloquium, and we are really fortunate and very happy to have you here. Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for attending this evening. It's 6 o'clock where I am and 5 o'clock where you are, so I've already had my dinner, so you're probably waiting for yours. So I do appreciate you coming at this time of day, and we'll get started with the presentation if everyone's ready to go. I will click share my screen and share the screen, press the button, and I think we are ready to go. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, everything working.
Okay, thank you, Professor Picardo. So we're going to be talking about the dynamics of emotions in L2 or L3 communication. I'm not going to say too much about those distinctions until the very end, but I do want to talk about this idea of dynamics and emotions and where it's come from, some of the traditions that have arisen, and some of the research questions that I think have been answered, and some of the research questions that are emerging now. We also will talk a little bit about methodology, so hopefully that you'll find that interesting as well, and I'll make a plea for expanding our work to do more individual quantitative work. So let me get started with a message of thanks. I'd like to thank all of my students and colleagues who participated in the research, Cape Breton University and SSHRC, who funded the research over the years. And I'd like to especially thank you all for inviting me today and allowing me to share with you in your class. So thank you all for attending. Now, what I'd like to do today is to outline the topics, is to make a case for studying emotion. Why should we be concerned about emotion? We'll also look at advances in emotion theory and research, and some of the basic roles and functions of emotion, and that hopefully will convince you of their importance. We'll also take a quick look at applications to language research and practice, and we'll arrive at some conclusions, and then have a question and answer session at the end. So, making the case for the study of emotion. Emotion is a fundamental process. It is something we're born with. If you think of a baby, of an infant, right? All they have are what looks like the beginnings of emotional reactions. They can't communicate, they can't speak, they don't have language, but they can communicate emotion very, very well. And any of you who are parents know that your baby can communicate with you very, very effectively how they're feeling. And it's essential to survival. So right from the very beginning of life, we have the rudimentary bits of emotion expression that are with us throughout our entire life. And we can learn languages, we can lose language through a brain injury, but we always maintain emotions, and we can express those emotions fairly well. We're also quite capable of reading other people's emotions. It's key to survival in a group. So emotions are a fundamental, basic, low-level process, They're pervasive. They happen in every situation that you can imagine. And one of their characteristic and defining features is they're very quick, they're rapid, they occur quickly. They're immediate reactions to events that are happening all around us. And as our emotion experience grows and we become more cognitive and more thoughtful, emotions integrate with our thinking and our social interaction thoroughly, from the lowest level physiological process to the highest level cognitive and social processes. We have emotion involvement everywhere in everything we do. And if you think about it, when emotions become aroused, when we have strong emotions, we almost lose control. We almost lose our sense of thoughtfulness and rationality to that lower level emotion experience. Many of us have been told at one time or another to stop and think, but I don't think anyone's ever been told to stop and feel something. The emotions are there. They're always there, and they just don't go away. And when the emotions are strong, the reactions are strong, and the emotions can take over. They can take over a language class. They can take over the students. They can become anxious. They can become excited, whatever. The emotional experience is contagious in the room. And for a long time, research on motivation really was the cornerstone of individual difference research in language. And I would argue that emotion may be the most fundamental source of motivation. Basically, if there's no emotion, there's no motivation. Emotion and motivation are tied together as closely as two strands of DNA. So as we look at the importance of emotion, I think it's almost undeniable that as teachers, as researchers, as those interested in just daily life and education, we have to be concerned with emotion because it's everywhere around us all the time. So we can take a look at two key roles for emotion. There's just a little something blocking my screen here. Let me just turn that. One is, as I said, emotions are a motivator. If we feel strong emotion, that predisposes us towards certain types of actions. So emotions motivate, energize, direct behavior. They give us an orientation toward what we might be doing. If we're feeling anxious, we have one set of behaviors. If we're feeling anger, we have a different set of behaviors. If we're feeling happy, that's a different set again. So emotion as a motivator is a key to understanding how students in front of you are reacting to a daily lesson or to anything that they're doing in the communication realm. But the other reason, I think, the other role for emotion in teaching and learning is as a readout, as a kind of a gauge on what's happening in the classroom. Emotions are constantly being updated, and you can read them in the faces of the people around you. That will indicate how well or how poorly a lesson is going, how well or how poorly the students are learning, how happy or how frustrated they seem to be feeling. And as a teacher, I know during COVID, it was very difficult to read the emotional expressions when all you saw was a letter on the screen representing the student's name. And it was so much more difficult to teach when you couldn't see those nonverbal cues coming back, because I couldn't tell how the students were thinking or how they were feeling. So emotion as a readout, as a gauge, as an indicator of what's happening in the classroom is very powerful. And if teachers are sensitive to looking for those cues, they can modify their lessons and adapt them on the fly, because as I said, emotions are very quick reactions. Now, if you see signs of boredom, if your class looks like this, you can bet learning is being affected. If you see signs of enjoyment, learning is being affected. If you see signs of anxiety, learning is being affected. It's being affected in different ways, but always when you read emotions in the room, something relevant is happening to the learning. So those were the two roles of emotion, as a readout and as a motivator, energizer that gives behavior direction. Now, I think one of the most important theories that have come out in the past 10 years or so is that positive and negative emotions have two different functions. They exist for two different purposes. They're not opposites. So positive emotion, according to the broaden and build theory, the role of positive emotion is to expand our thinking. It's to broaden our experience, allow us to take in new information, and to build skills. So when we're having positive emotions, we tend to do things like explore and play and be creative. So our thought process expands outward and the world opens up. Negative emotions have the opposite function in the sense that instead of expanding our thought process, they tend to focus. They restrict our thought process. So imagine if there was something in the room that happens just right now that makes you afraid. A loud noise, maybe something falls in your office or in your room, and you have a jolt of fear. What that fear will do is focus you in on finding out what just happened. You'll deal with the situation in your room. If the cat knocked over a glass, then you'll have to deal with that because the emotion will demand that you take care of it or at least find out what's happening. So these negative emotions tend to focus our attention. They demand our attention in ways that positive emotions don't. Positive emotions are much more diffuse. They don't predispose specific actions the way negative emotions do. So the broaden and build theory talks about the narrowed focus of negative emotions, that strong emotions can take over our thinking and feeling, but they're essentially adaptive. I'll say more about that in a moment. Positive emotions tend to expand our focus. We can notice more new things. We can take in information and learn more efficiently. I know when I'm watching a movie, if I watch a movie that I'm enjoying, I can quote back the lines of the movie without ever hearing it a second time. You just remember things better when you're in a positive frame of mind. And if you're anxious, it's much more difficult to learn, to get information in because you're so focused on fear and protecting yourself. Another emotion that hasn't been widely studied in language, but might be, is anger. And anger occurs when something is blocking a goal. And the purpose, the function of anger is to remove obstacles, to destroy obstacles. So imagine there's a rock in the middle of your doorway and you have to smash it to get out. That's what anger does. You get mad at whatever's blocking your goal and you destroy the object that's blocking that. Positive emotion doesn't have that same urgency to it. It's very pleasant, it's very welcome, but positive emotions don't necessarily have that immediate focus. But what they do over a longer period of time is help us build resources for the future. Things like social capital. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but the idea that the people around us provide networks that allow us to do things. One of my favorite stories is a colleague of mine had students in Iowa, and there was a snowstorm, and a student who was an international student, brand new to the area, had only one phone number, and that was the phone number of a friend from class who she could call to come and get her because the buses weren't running. So she was able to use the language class to build social capital very quickly and solve an urgent problem. She had to get home in a snowstorm, and she had a phone number because she was in this language class and communicating, building friendships. So that's the long-term effects of positive emotions. And things like language enjoyment can build up those relationships over time. The other thing that positive emotions do is they tend to undo the lingering effects of negative emotions. So the lingering physiological effects of negative emotions can be reduced by the presence of positive. So whereas negative emotions like fear, anger, and disgust tend to produce rather specific actions, like fear tends to lead you to protect yourself, anger to destroy obstacles, disgust leads to rejection. There's a very strong action sequences. They're predisposed specific things that we're going to do when we feel those emotions. Positive emotions take on a slightly different quality. They expand the repertoire and allow us to do things like have creativity and play if we're feeling enjoyment. Interest will allow us to explore, take in new information, and be open to new experiences. An emotion like contentment is a very soft, subtle emotion, but it allows us to savor our experiences and integrate prior experiences. If someone thinks about their language learning journey, right, and some of my colleagues have done this with their students, they've gotten them to think about how far they've come. Moments where they might be feeling anxious, a test is coming up, or they have something that is making them feel nervous, they'll sit and they'll contemplate the success that they've had, how far they've come as learners. And that gives them a sense that, there's a mix of positive and negative, but that you can't ignore the positive because it allows you to integrate and savor those experiences. And it can generate a sense of pride, which allows us to demonstrate skills. So emotions in classrooms can be very important. Things like creativity, joy, play, exploring new environments, getting new information, taking in more information, learning very efficiently. Those are the things teachers love. We all want to see that among our students. So positive emotions are the gateway to those kind of experiences that teachers genuinely value. So again, part of building the case for emotion is that these are the behaviors that we very much want to see as teachers. Antonio Damasio has said, we're not thinking machines. Education theory often treats us as thinking machines. We are cognitive thinking machines. He says, no, we are feeling machines that think. Sometimes. And sometimes the feelings take over. We never lose those feelings, but sometimes we can lose the idea of thinking clearly, right? So we are not thinking machines. We are feeling machines that can think. So that means that we need to know more about emotions in second language. We need to know more about how to deal with them as researchers, as teachers, as theorists. Some emotions have been studied, and we're going to go over a couple of them now, but many others are not. This is a wide open field. There's a lot that can be done. The most often studied emotion is anxiety. Language anxiety has been a focus. It's been prominent in literature since the 1980s. And anxiety is one of those very interesting, complex emotions that has a blend of cognitive, feelings, and behaviors. So the cognitive interference that happens, if you're worried about a test, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know if I know this, I don't know how to think about this, it just interferes with your thought process. Feelings of nervousness, apprehension, fear, they're unwelcome. And behaviors include avoidance and withdrawal. And if you think about how to prevent people from learning languages, you would prevent them from speaking with other people. So this idea of avoidance and withdrawal, when anxiety is high, learning is being affected. So anxiety was a central concern and has been for a long time. And we have this interesting interaction among lower level systems with anxiety. So we all know about the bodily arousal. If I asked you, in fact, why don't I do this? In the chat, can you type in one of the symptoms of anxiety that you feel, physical symptoms? So what happens to you when you personally get anxious? I'll just pause for a moment and let you type that in the chat. Okay, my chat is not coming up. Can someone just unmute your microphone and read what's coming up?
Me to do?
Please, yes.
Okay, so dry mouth, sweats, hands sweaty, nausea, red face, increase heart rate. I start biting my nails, stop breathing, change in breathing, tight feeling in the chest, pounding heart. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we all know what all of those symptoms feel like. We may not experience all of them, but if someone says that they're feeling anxious, we know that that's what their body is doing. And that brings along with it feelings like, I'm afraid, I'm worried, I'm concerned, I'm distressed. It's a very unpleasant feeling. And what it does is it interacts with your sense of purpose. So anxiety activates a fear response, and fear is associated with protecting yourself. So when anxiety is high, it means that your tendency is to protect yourself, to do something that gets you out of the situation. So when we're looking at students in the long run, high anxiety may mean that they're avoiding the very same learning situations that would allow them to progress. So the social and expressive side of anxiety, we see red face, we see adaptive movements like biting your nails, and we tend to avoid other people, or some people in high anxiety will seek out other people and they'll want comfort and companionship. So as an experience, that whole collection is a complex emotion. That's anxiety. There have been 3 recent meta-analyses done on anxiety, all reached what I consider to be the same conclusion, a remarkably consistent conclusion, considering the breadth of research done around the world. So here are the three recent meta-analyses, and you can look those up at your leisure. But the correlation between anxiety and achievement in the Timori study, the correlation was minus 0.36. In the Boats et al. Study, minus 0.39. In the Zhang study, minus 0.34. 34, 36, 39, those are very, very similar numbers. They're coming to similar conclusions about the role of anxiety in achievement. The middle study looked at different speaking, reading, writing skills, and you can see that some skills are more heavily affected by anxiety than others. Listening tends to be the one that's most strongly affected. And to my surprise, speaking was the one least well correlated with anxiety. And that to me was a very interesting finding. So if anxiety is an interest of yours, I would highly recommend these three meta-analyses as a good starting point for launching your understanding of anxiety and how it affects communication and learning. But there are many other emotions to consider. Anxiety is one. It's a very interesting one, very relevant, but there's a lot more to be done. And many of these developments in the study of emotion are influenced by positive psychology. The three founding pillars of positive psychology are the study of positive emotion, character traits, and institutions. Very little work has been done on institutions. So what makes for a good school experience? What makes for a positive faculty experience? Those kind of things are not as well studied as things like emotions and character traits. And Sarah Mercer presented some data last year that shows positive emotions are by far the most studied topic in positive psychology in second language. So we're developing very, very rapidly a good literature, a good sized literature on positive emotions. There are other concepts that, if you're interested in positive psychology, things like flow, courage, peace, empathy, enjoyment, those are all topics that are available. And positive psychology is making serious inroads into the theorizing in our area. So again, I would encourage you, if you're interested, to look up what's happening in positive psychology, because there's some very interesting work being done all around the world. Now, this is a mess, and I realize you would never tell young teachers to show a slide like this. Okay, so what I wanted to do here is overwhelm you with information that shows the connection between positive emotion and motivation. So across the top, we have familiar motivation concepts. Things like, I have second language anxiety, let's forget that for a minute, but self-confidence, acculturation, integrative orientation, instrumental orientation, the ideal L2 self, the ought to L2 self, effort invested, perceived competence, quantity and quality of contact with native speakers. I'd like you to look at the very bottom, that bottom row, the positivity ratio. That's a ratio of 10 positive to 10 negative emotions. The more positive your emotion experience, the higher your ratio score. So what that bottom line is showing is that people who tend to experience more positive emotions across the board are more highly motivated, no matter how you want to conceptualize motivation. The only thing that's a negative correlation is with second language anxiety, which makes sense, right? Positive emotions and negative emotions tend not to occur at the same time. So the more positive emotions, the fewer negative emotions. That's the undoing effect I mentioned earlier. So if you are concerned about motivation, you're also concerned about emotion. Emotion comes along with just about every motivation concept you can imagine. But I also wanted to mention that there's no such thing as bad emotions. Now, you might find that a little bit surprising, but what I mean is some emotions are more welcome, are more pleasant than others, but all emotions have a purpose. Even unpleasant ones are adaptive. By their very nature, emotions are rapidly changing, dynamic, and adaptive. They help us deal with the situation that's in front of us. We've developed intense emotional experience every day of our lives. So we trust our emotions. We think with our feelings. But what we often forget, and what's a lot of theory is guilty of minimizing, is the idea that we have mixed emotions most of the time. It is actually very rare to experience one pure emotion. Things like anger or fear, at their most intense, might be the only thing that we're really experiencing. But at almost everyday interactions, we have several emotions running at the same time. The emotions co-occur. So we can feel both excited and anxious, happy and worried at the same time. So this idea of mixed emotions or ambivalence is a combination of positive and negative emotions at the same time. And this is where some of the research is really taking a look these days. This is where I think some of the newer research is headed, is the interactions among emotions. So let me begin by kind of looking back at, what does the literature show about the prevalence of enjoyment and anxiety, one positive and one negative emotion. If you look at the graph on the screen there, you can take a look at the enjoyment curve. There's a lot of people experience pretty high enjoyment. So there's very few people that have no enjoyment, and it peaks around 4 to 4.5 out of 5. There's a lot of people really enjoying their language classes. But look at the anxiety experience. It's much flatter. It's a flattened curve. So some people, even with lots of experience, still have a lot of anxiety. Some people with little experience have very little anxiety. It's a much less consistent field. Enjoyment tends to be high for most people in this sample. Anxiety, a much more different experience in this group. And this was an international web survey of over 1,000 people. So it's a fairly diverse group, but they all tend to have a fairly strong language experience, lots of experience learning languages. So what this shows is that there's a real prevalence for enjoyment, and anxiety is a bit more of a mix. Some people have high anxiety, other people have lower anxiety. And as you might expect, those who have more high, consider themselves higher in competence, tend to experience enjoyment more often and anxiety less often. And those who feel like they're far below average in their abilities experience anxiety and enjoyment at roughly the same amounts. Now, this is within a large group. Okay, so I want to emphasize that this is across a large group. Because what we're doing by looking at large groups is we're ignoring the individuals in individual difference research. I think it's really important to put the individual back in individual differences. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Imagine you have a learner very happily running along with their day-to-day learning activities. They're doing great. And all of a sudden, teacher asks a question and a wall of anxiety comes up. What we need to do as teachers, as learners, as researchers, is understand what happens when that wall of anxiety hits. What's going on at that moment in time? What does the learner do? Do they crash into the wall and stop, or do they find a way around it? Right? We have to find some way of studying what happens in these day-to-day, moment-to-moment experiences of emotion. So we need an approach that captures the dynamic nature of emotions rather than answers on a survey that ask you to look back over a summary of your experience. And that's where complex dynamic systems theory comes in. And I know some of you have had some experience with looking at this, and others have not. So we're not going to get into the details of complex dynamic systems theory, but we're going to look at what it can do for the study of emotion. So just as a bit of a recap or just a brief introduction, if you've not seen this, complex dynamic systems theory is probably best described as a meta theory. It's not a theory about what's happening, but it's a theory about how to study lots of things that are happening. So it's a theory about how to create theory, if you like. It's focused on interactions between and within systems. What it allows us to do is take familiar concepts, things like anxiety, enjoyment, and conceptualize them as continuously interacting systems. So feelings of anxiety emerge from the interactions among lower level systems. Anxiety is a readout. It's a gauge on what the rest of the systems are doing. By looking at the detail of that experience, we can look at the processes that create it. And it allows us to emphasize complexity and change. In other words, rather than asking someone, how anxious are you usually, we can ask them, how are you feeling at this moment and at the next moment, and understand what's producing the change that we might observe. This is a different way, a different approach to studying the same psychological processes, things like anxiety, enjoyment, motivation, aptitude, and all of the other great things that we've been interested in for a long time. But it's a different way of studying them. It's a different starting point. because the emphasis is on complexity and change. So complex dynamic systems theories allow us to generate new research questions that focus on process and how processes come into focus over a particular timescale. Some processes occur over a long time. Language development occurs over a very long timescale. But I've been talking about emotions being very rapid, very quick to change, instantly turning on when you run into a wall of anxiety. And we need research methods that allow us to study that. So if we're looking at how does communication unfold and what are communication processes doing, if they emerge from multiple interacting systems that occur, some on a long-term timescale, some on a very short-term timescale of seconds, traditional methods often overlook those sorts of changes. They don't look at intra-individual variation. In other words, the variability of one person over a given period of time. And that's what I wanted to talk about in the time that we have remaining, is how can we look at emotion as an intra-individual, rapidly changing dynamic system. And if I can make a little bit of a tangent here, I would like to really encourage you to think about how can we study individuals to really understand their experience at the individual level. And I don't mean just with qualitative research. I'm looking at quantitative research as well, because uniqueness is not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to study why things work differently for some people. Right? If you look at the standard way of doing individual differences research with correlations, the broad pattern is described, and all of that intra-individual variation is thrown in the error term. It's literally error in a regression equation. So why? It's that data, but my graduate supervisor was Bob Gardner, and he always said, the data are trying to tell you their story. And if the error term is trying to tell you something, we should be listening. And those error terms are the exceptions, the unaccounted for variability, the unique individuals. They all wind up contributing to the error term in our regression equations. Why don't we interrogate that and find out what it is they're trying to tell us? So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is talk about how we've been putting a new research method together, the ideodynamic method that looks at motivation and emotion in motion. Right? So we're putting emotions into motion. So the new types of questions that you can ask from this complexity-oriented theory would be things like, how do anxiety and enjoyment rise and fall during a communication event? How do these two variables change together? Typical research would show a negative correlation between anxiety and enjoyment. I showed you that earlier. But is that always the way it is? Is that the only possible pattern? And what do participants in the research say about fluctuations in emotion? There's no better expert on your emotional experience than you. I know we have some hesitation sometimes with self-report, but if you want to know what someone is thinking, the best thing you can do is ask them. They're pretty capable of telling you. People do like to talk about their emotional experiences. They're very capable of doing that. So if you look at the types of questions that we're seeing on the screen here, how do anxiety and enjoyment rise and fall during a communication event? How do those variables change in relationship during the course of an event? These are different types of research questions. I'm not asking, what is the correlation between anxiety and enjoyment? I'm asking different types of questions here, dynamic research questions. So let me show you a couple of studies that we've done. One of the first ones, this was a former student of mine, Carmen Boudreau, who looked at meaningful photos. And this is a task that's sometimes done in positive psychology to get people to communicate and talk about experiences. And we thought, wouldn't it be great to do meaningful photos in second language? So people bring to the lab with them a photo. It could be on their phone. It could be a photo that they bring, but it's a meaningful person, a meaningful event, a meaningful animal. So people bring photos of their dog, and they're very, very happy to talk about them. And what Carmen found in her study, and we found it every time we've used this task since, is that the emotions are complex. So the dog, I mentioned, the photo of the dog, was a very happy and warm experience, but the dog died. So it was also a very sad experience. So as people bring their photos, they're talking about the complexity of emotion experiences, and they're using second language to do it. So this is a pretty powerful type of activity that people enjoy doing and can really give you a window into their emotion experiences. So we had a second task in that study where we had people do an oral interview, the kind of questions you might expect in an oral interview. Describe what you're wearing, which tends to be a very easy task for most people in our samples. Discuss the role of Parliament in the Canadian system of government, which might be difficult for some people who work there. They may, it's a difficult question. Describe the education system, count to 100 by tens, give directions to the nearest shopping mall. So a variety of tasks, some relatively easy. The shopping mall was deceptively difficult because people think, oh yeah, I know how to get there, but then they lose the word for traffic light or something like that. So these are interesting questions as well. And what we do is we track their emotion experiences during their communication event. So they come into the lab, we record them on video, and then we have software that's been developed that allows them to use the keyboard to enter their reactions continuously over time. So the type of graph you see on the screen there is a graph that comes out of this study, and the vertical bars are different tasks. Okay, so you can see emotions are rising and falling continuously as they perform different second language tasks. And because they watch the video right away, they tend to be very good at describing their emotion experiences that they were feeling just a few moments before. Let me give you a quick demonstration here of this task. This is a former student of mine, Christy Bryson.
Hi, my name is Christy, and I'm going.
Sorry, are you able to hear the audio on that? Yes? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
To demonstrate the anion variable tester. This is a previously recorded video. At this point in the video, I was quite relaxed. I felt more nervous here as I was stumbling over what I wanted to say. I'm now going to pause the video, click finished. There's the data.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there because all she shows is the printout. It just prints on the printer right beside her, and that's how we do these studies. That's our ideodynamic method. So what we expected to find when people talked about meaningful photos or where they did those oral interview questions was that as anxiety is rising, enjoyment would be coming down. So they watch the video once and rate their anxiety. They go back and they watch it again and rate their enjoyment. So we have two continuous graphs that we can put one on top of the other and see what are the patterns, the rising and falling levels of anxiety and enjoyment. And we found that when anxiety was going up and enjoyment coming down, people were struggling to find vocabulary. They didn't know what to talk about. They lacked experience. They didn't know how to express their thoughts, or they became aware of the environment, the testing environment, the presence of the video camera, or that there was a research assistant listening to them and they weren't friends, they didn't know them. So any one of those could increase anxiety, reduce enjoyment. Anxiety coming down, enjoyment going up was observed when people understood the task and they knew how to respond. They had something that they wanted to communicate, something they wanted to say. They were talking about something meaningful. It was what we would call authentic communication. They had a personal connection to the topic and they wanted to talk about it. We also observed unexpected patterns, and these would typically be thrown into the error term. These are the ones that are really interesting. High anxiety coupled with high enjoyment. Now, if you think about that, that's at first blush, you might think, well, that's unusual, but anyone who's ever had a baby understands high anxiety and high enjoyment. If you've ever gotten married or had to take an important exam that you think you're going to be okay with, high anxiety and high enjoyment coupled together. Hopefully when you're doing your thesis defense, you have a combination of enjoying the experience, but you're probably going to be feeling anxious at the same time. So these do occur. We don't tend to talk about them because they don't couple together. They don't combine as often as high anxiety, low enjoyment, but they do happen and they're interesting experiences. The whole study of flow that concept, if you're familiar with the concept of flow, it's a combination of an enjoyable experience that's also potentially anxiety provoking. So it's a combination of emotions. Okay? And then we also saw low anxiety and low enjoyment, and that's often associated with feelings of boredom or disengagement. And language boredom has become a major topic the past couple of years as well. So low anxiety, low enjoyment, low emotional engagement, boredom, disengagement, nothing to say. So here are the patterns that we saw. So we could overlay the anxiety and enjoyment patterns that you see on the screen. And this is what it looked like for the photo activity. Okay. And I'll just skip over the details here. It was kind of what you would expect. I remembered my words, things were going great. If I was struggling with my words, things were not going great. But I wanted to show you participant 9 here, who had a very interesting pair of patterns. So here's the task for answering the questions, that the oral interview, and here's their graph for photos. And I wanted to point out 2 things. This particular sequence right here, where we look at the high levels of anxiety paired with low levels of enjoyment. That's exactly what the research literature would lead you to expect. High anxiety, low enjoyment. But look at this pattern. High anxiety, high enjoyment. This is the unusual pattern that typical research on individual differences is missing. This is an interesting pattern. What's happening? We'd have to go back to the video to find out what the participant was doing, listen to the interview as she talks about her experience to really unpack all the things that are happening during this interesting sequence. So what she said was, in the question activity, I liked what I was talking about, and I knew what I was saying a little bit. Once I knew what I was talking about, what direction to go in, then it was more enjoyable because I was into it. Authentic communication. In the picture activity, my enjoyment dipped down because I was having trouble explaining some stuff. When I had low enjoyment, it was because I really couldn't express those ideas as effectively as I would have liked because I just didn't have the words. And here you see that integration of vocabulary with emotional experience, with metacognition and self-awareness. This, in these 3 or 4 lines, this is a highly complex picture of what's happening. The person is aware of how much she knows. She's aware that she should be able to answer this and could easily do it in English, her native language, is struggling to do this in French, her second language. That's giving her frustration because she can't express herself the way she wants to. She wants to authentically communicate, but is struggling. And all of this is happening within a few seconds. That's what this method allows us to really dig into, that emotion experience. So what we see is we can be interested in differences among groups. We can focus in on differences among individuals, that's individual differences research. But this research is focused even more specifically on differences from moment to moment within one person. And that's our ideodynamic method. So I want to show you, just in the couple minutes we have left here, what I think is an interesting idea, the interaction of emotions. Okay, so here we have a study where we looked at the interaction of anxiety and willingness to communicate. If you've seen the willingness to communicate concept, it's the idea that some people are more willing to talk, they're more ready to talk, other people hold themselves back. How does that interact with anxiety? Well, it's one of the most reliable correlations in the literature. If you want to do a study where you know what your correlation is going to be, correlate anxiety and willingness to communicate. They tend to be very strongly correlated in almost every study. But remember, we're not looking at the typical patterns here. We're looking at the individual moment-to-moment experience. We've changed the question. The question here is not what is the correlation between anxiety and willingness. We're asking, when is there a correlation between anxiety and willingness? For example, we found near zero correlations in some segments. We found a positive correlation between anxiety and willingness in other segments. And we found the typical negative correlation in other segments. So what is the correlation between anxiety and willingness? Well, it's positive, it's negative, and it's near zero. It depends on what's happening in the communication. And that's the power of this method, because it allows you to get at more detailed questions that you might not have seen otherwise. This is a summary of the size and strength of the correlations from that particular study. That same individual that I just showed you, let me go back. Right. So this individual, the reddish brown line is willingness to communicate. The blue line is anxiety. You can see we've called this person Ryan. So Ryan had a lot of dynamics, a lot of rising and falling over time. And the graph I showed you here arbitrarily segmented this conversation into 30-second units. So the first 30 seconds, the next 30 seconds, and I showed you the correlations over those time periods. So minus 0.1, minus 0.34, plus 0.49, plus 0.42, minus 0.24, a variety of correlations within this one person. But if we said, well, what if we took smaller segments, 10 seconds, and did a moving window correlation? And with moving window, imagine a spreadsheet, right? Your Excel spreadsheet here. You take the top 10 rows, one rating anxiety, the next column is the rating of willingness to communicate. Take the first 10, okay? And then you move that window down and take number 2 to 11. Then you move it down 3 to 12. So as you move it down, you're eliminating one row of data and adding a new row. So as you're moving down, you're moving a window across the person's experience. If that window is 10 seconds long, you get the blue bar here, right? Wildly different correlations. This is the size of the correlation between anxiety and willingness to communicate. Sometimes it's high and positive. Sometimes it's strong and negative. Sometimes it's near zero. But it's a very, very dynamic pattern. The relationship between anxiety and willingness to communicate changes moment to moment. That's what this blue line is telling us. If we take the longer duration of 25-second intervals, so our moving window is now not 10, but is now 25 rows of data, that shows more stability, right? We don't see the rise in falling correlations they don't go quite as high, they don't go quite as low. And if we used 50-second intervals, the green line, we see again a smoother correlation as well. What would happen if we, instead of having 10, 25, or 50 seconds, what if we looked at these over a week, a month, a year, your entire language learning experience? When we give questionnaires, we ask people, how do you typically react? How much anxiety do you typically feel? That's over a very, very long time window. So if you like, what I'm trying to show here is you can take a very short window of experience. You can make it bigger and bigger, and eventually you get trait level individual difference research. They're not different things. They just have a different time scale, different focus. Okay, so that's the changing levels of correlation based on the length of time you're studying in a dynamic communication environment. Okay, so I wanted to kind of finish up with this idea of willingness to communicate. And I know it wasn't in the abstract, but we just had a book accepted, so I wanted to mention this to you. If you've looked at willingness to communicate, you might have seen this. I call this the pyramid model. One of my students told me, that's not a pyramid, that's just a triangle. And he was right. It's just a triangle. And you know why it's just a triangle? Because it's two-dimensional, right? All of these things are relevant. We have communication readiness based on everything at the bottom there. We have communication behavior at the very top. But what if we turn that on its side and call that the second language? And imagine we add a third language. All of those processes change, right? You may still have the same personality, but it's expressed differently in different languages. The different social situations are treated differently in different languages. Motivations, your self-confidence, all changes when you change the language. So if you like, we've taken our two-dimensional triangle and really turned it into a pyramid in this new book with Alistair Henry. What we like to imagine is that L1 is at the back. You can't see L1 in this diagram, but it's that remaining face of the pyramid. L2 on this side, L3 on that side. And so we get this idea of very rich experience buried inside that pyramid, all the corridors inside the pyramid, all the connections from your confidence in second language, your confidence in third language, and how that connects to your confidence in your first language. By looking at more than two languages, L1, L2, L3, we can start to create a very rich tapestry of interrelationships among these concepts as you change language, something that Jean-Marc Dewally's been talking about for the past 10, 15 years. So if we look at the pyramid as a concept, right? All the things that are happening, all those lower level processes that are happening that we don't necessarily see. Emotion is relevant to every single box in this pyramid. Everywhere is emotion experience. And as Jean-Marc has told us, it's language specific, language dependent. So if you've learned your second language and now you're learning a third, it's not just simply you take your anxiety from one and transfer it to another. They can be very, very different experiences. And these moments where we decide to enact communication, where we move from being willing to communicate to actually doing it, to using the language, they lie at the heart of translanguaging, a concept that's been relevant for a while now, and the situated decision making that's in the language mode model of Grosjean. So we're looking at how people and their emotion experiences change from one language to another. And in this particular study, we had a group of immigrants to Sweden, and they all spoke English. And the language situation in Sweden is that you can get by in English in your day-to-day life fairly easily. Of course, you can get by in Swedish fairly easily as well, but they couldn't get by in their native language. So they all had a native language, a second language, English, and a third language would be Swedish. They're all learning Swedish in Sweden because they're all planning to build their lives there. But the contact language, the second language, allowed them to avoid using Swedish. Right? If you can go into your pharmacy, if you can go into your doctor's office, if you can go, buy a bus ticket, and you can do it in English, and everybody in the situation speaks English, then that's fine. But if you're willing to try your Swedish, that's when you're going to see progress in language learning. So this is something that we're looking at is the L2, L3 dimensions and how they bring on different emotion experiences. So in conclusion, I think there's a very clear need to understand emotion and emotion processes in language and language learning classrooms and language communication, not only among the learners, but also among the teachers. I was at a conference a few years ago and Sarah Mercer gave a brilliant talk where she said, spare a thought for the teacher. Right? We do all of this research on learners, spare a thought for the teacher. And so Mercer has been very prolific over the past few years in really bringing teachers and teacher well-being into the conversation. And a lot of those processes that are related to learner and teacher well-being are at least, you can read them in the emotion experiences people talk about. So emotions help to cause those experiences, and they help to reveal them as well. Studies of emotion dynamics with individuals, those idiodynamic studies I was showing you a minute ago, they provide a novel way to address new research questions about the learning process, about the interaction between emotions. As a communication, if you're trying to teach your students communication, then you're interested in very pragmatic terms. If you're interested in emotion theory, this again allows you to ask different questions and generate different emotional answers about how do emotions interact. And it's always advisable to look at classroom and out of classroom activities. And one of those ways of dealing with how do people engage with a second language activity, a task, is to look at in granular detail their emotion experiences as they went through the task, because those emotions are intertwined with absolutely everything they do, everything they think, and everything they experience. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And I guess we'll open the floor for questions.